My son shamed me in court, telling everyone I was a senile old woman who no longer even knew her own name. The voice was David's, my own son, but the words felt like they belonged to a stranger. They echoed through the courtroom, so cold and calculated. Right beside him, my daughter-in-law Sarah nodded along with this look of false compassion on her face. Her eyes, though, they were gleaming with greed. They were asking a judge to declare me incompetent. They wanted to take control of everything I had, but especially the house. The house where I raised David, the very same son who was now standing there, publicly stabbing me in the back. Every word he spoke was a lie, a perfect little dagger aimed right at my soul. And I just sat there and watched him in silence. The pain was so big, it felt like it would split my chest wide open. They thought my silence was weakness. They looked at me and saw the sign of a mind that was already gone, just like they wanted. They presented their evidence, questionable medical reports from doctors I'd never met, witnesses who I knew they must have paid. It was all a performance, all to prove that I could no longer manage my own life. I could see the contempt on their faces, the absolute certainty that they had already won. I could almost see their thoughts. They were already picturing themselves as the owners of everything. I could see them selling the house, my house, splitting the money between them. And me, they'd put me in some forgotten nursing home, a place where I would just be another anonymous old woman waiting for the end. They had it all planned out, but they had no idea. They had no idea that my silence wasn't defeat. It was the calm of someone who was holding the most important card in the entire game. In that moment, sitting in that hard wooden chair, I wasn't just listening to their accusations. I was deciding their future. A future where the inheritance they were fighting for so fiercely, the inheritance they were willing to destroy me for, had ceased to be theirs a long, long time ago. But what they couldn't imagine was that the stage for my humiliation would become the setting for their greatest loss. My name is Eleanor. I'm 76 years old, and for more than 40 years, I was a seamstress. My hands, the ones that tremble a little now, have stitched together so many dreams for other people. But mostly, they stitched together the dreams of my own family. I was widowed far too young, and I dedicated every penny I earned, every drop of my sweat, to giving David, my only son, the kind of life that I never had. Our house, it's a modest 2-story home, nothing grand, but it's always been full of love. It has a little garden that I still tend to myself, and it has always been the heart of our world. It was in that house that I celebrated every single one of his achievements. From what I've always been a woman of few words. My observation has always been my strongest sense. My late husband, Arthur, he used to say that about me. He'd say I could see right into people's souls, not by listening to what they said, but by watching what they did. He and I, we had our secrets, little pacts of love and protection we made with each other. One of those pacts was about this very house, our safe harbor. I can still hear his voice, clear as day. Eleanor, he always told me. This house is your fortress. No one can ever take it from you. Smile. I held those words deep in my heart, like a promise. My life was quiet, but it was mine. I'd wake up early, before the sun got too high, and go out to tend to my rose bushes. I'd have my morning coffee sitting on the porch, and sometimes a neighbor, Mrs. Gable from next door, would stop by for a little chat. I loved my routine. I loved my independence. And above all, I loved the memories that lived in every single corner of that house. It was a simple life, a dignified life, and it was a life that I had built with my own two hands. I believed the love I had planted within those walls would be my protection in old age. But I was about to discover that greed grows faster than any flower. Everything began to change when Sarah came into David's life. His visits, which used to be filled with long hugs and easy conversations on the porch, became quick and almost businesslike. He'd stand in the doorway, already looking at his watch, while Sarah stood beside him. She was a woman who was always perfectly put together, but her smile never quite seemed to reach her eyes. When she looked at my house, it wasn't with the warmth of a guest, but with the cool, appraising eye of a surveyor. She'd run a hand along the banister I'd polished for 40 years and comment on the potential of the lot. Or she would gaze out at my garden, the one I poured my soul into, and say something like, "A full renovation here would really increase the property value." I could feel the cold chill of financial interest behind every forced. David, my David, who once defended me and our home against any criticism, now just nodded along. "Sarah has a good eye for these things, Mom," he'd say, not quite meeting my gaze. Soon, the little digs started, the excuses to push me away. They began saying I was forgetful, that I was starting to confuse things. It was subtle at first. If I couldn't remember the name of an actor from some movie on television, Sarah would exchange a meaningful glance with David, a little sigh that was meant for me to see. These minor, everyday slips of memory were suddenly blown up, turned into evidence of my incapacity. One afternoon, I couldn't find my reading glasses. I'd simply left them in the kitchen, but Sarah spoke about it for days, her voice full of that fake concern. "What if you forget something important, Eleanor? What if you forget to turn off the stove?" The pain of their indifference was like a fine needle, slowly and constantly piercing my heart. Promises of Sunday lunches, a tradition we'd kept since David was a boy, were broken at the last minute. "Something came up," it'd say over the phone, his voice sounding tired and far away. My phone calls started going unanswered. I'd sit by the phone, my hand hovering over it, just wanting to hear my son's voice. But my calls would go straight to his voicemail. The silence that followed was deafening. I tried so hard to make excuses for them. "He's busy," I'd tell myself. "He has his own life with Sarah now." But deep down, I could smell the betrayal approaching, like the scent of rain on dry earth just before a storm. The loneliness began to set in. But it wasn't a loneliness from being physically by myself. I was used to that. This was a deeper, colder loneliness. It was the feeling of being completely disconnected from the only child I had left in the world. He was still here, but it felt like he was a million miles away. I didn't know it yet, but they weren't just pulling away. They were building the case they would use to try and erase me from my own story. The bomb dropped on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops, when I saw their car pull into the driveway. David and Sarah. Unannounced. My first thought was a flicker of hope. Maybe they had come for a surprise visit. Maybe they missed me. But when I opened the front door, that hope died instantly. Their faces were grim, set like stone. David was holding a sheaf of papers in his hand, clutching them so tightly his knuckles were white. They stepped inside without a hug, without even a proper hello. They walked past me into the living room, the one where David's baby pictures still sat on the mantelpiece, and stood there like strangers, or worse, like officials sent to deliver bad news. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson," Sarah said, and the name hit me like a slap. Mrs. Peterson, not Mom, not Eleanor. It was a name for a stranger on a legal document. It drew a line in the sand, and I knew in that second that I was on the other side of it. David was the one who spoke next, though his eyes were fixed on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. His voice was thick with an emotion I knew was fake, a carefully rehearsed sorrow that didn't touch his eyes. "Mom," he began, but then corrected himself, as if catching a mistake. We need to talk to you about something serious. We're going to court. We're filing for a conservatorship." The words just hung there in the quiet air of my living room. A conservatorship. They wanted to take my life away from me, piece by piece, and they were announcing it as if they were telling me about a change in their vacation plans. "It's for your own good," he continued, his voice wavering with that false sincerity. You're no longer fit to care for yourself, or this house." He finally glanced at me, just for a second, and in that fleeting look, I saw a flicker of shame before he looked away again. Sarah, however, had no such shame. She stepped forward, her expression all business. She was always more direct. "Eleanor, you're becoming a danger to yourself," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "And the assets that David's father worked so hard for, they need to be protected, managed properly." The humiliation washed over me in a cold, paralyzing wave. The assets his father worked so hard for, as if I hadn't worked right alongside him, as if I hadn't kept this house standing on my own for decades after he was gone. They wanted to strip me not just of the right to decide if I wanted toast or oatmeal for breakfast, but of my entire history, my dignity. They wanted to turn me into an invalid, a child, an empty shell whose only purpose was to not be a burden. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped somewhere in my throat. I didn't cry in front of them. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I just stood there, my hand resting on the back of my favorite armchair, and felt the floor disappear from under my feet. The silence that fell in that room wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged. It was a declaration of war. They must have taken my silence as agreement, or as the confusion they were so eager to prove. David placed the papers on my little end table, right next to a book I was reading, a court summons. It looked so alien there, a piece of paper that represented betrayal in its cruelest, most official form. Then, without another word, they turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind them. On that day, I understood that a son's love could have a price, and they were willing to destroy me to avoid paying it. After the front door clicked shut, the silence in my living room was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the official papers they had left on my table. A summons. It felt like a gravestone marking the death of the love I thought my son had for me. I let a few silent tears fall then. But they weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of profound disappointment, a final cleansing of the last bit of hope I had for him. And as those tears dried on my cheeks, something else took their place. A cold, quiet clarity. While they were driving away, probably congratulating themselves, thinking I was in my living room, crumbling into a million pieces, my mind was already working. It was faster and clearer than it had been in years. The shock had burned away the fog of sadness, and then I remembered a conversation with my Arthur so many years ago, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, just like this one. We were sitting right here in this room. He had taken my hand and looked at me with that serious, loving gaze of his. "Eleanor," he'd said, "the world isn't always kind. And family? Well, sometimes family forgets what matters." He then gave me a simple manila envelope, sealed and already yellowing with age. "Put this somewhere safe," he had told me. "Use this only if the world, or anyone in it, ever tries to turn its back on you." I took a deep breath, the first steady one since they'd arrived. My body still felt shaky, but my purpose was firm. I walked over to my old sewing chest, the one that smells of cedar and thread. It's where I've kept all my treasures, scraps of David's baby blanket, old patterns, and buttons from dresses long gone. And there, at the very bottom, beneath a layer of faded fabrics, was the manila envelope, just as Arthur had left it. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside there wasn't a long letter or some complicated instruction. There was just a small, neatly folded piece of paper with a name and a phone number, written in Arthur's familiar, steady hand, Mr. Davies. Arthur's best friend since they were boys. Our trusted family lawyer, who had retired years ago, but had always told us to call if we ever truly needed him. I went to the phone on the wall in the kitchen, the old rotary one, and I dialed the numbers, my index finger shaking with each turn. The phone rang 3 times, and then a calm, deep voice answered. "Davies." It was like a balm on a burn. "Mr. Davies," I said, my own voice sounding small at first. "It's Eleanor Peterson." There was a pause, and then his voice softened. "Eleanor, it's been too long. Is everything all right?" And I told him everything. The visits that got shorter, Sarah's appraising looks, the accusations of being forgetful. I told him about the unannounced visit, the court summons sitting on my table, and the words they used. I didn't hold anything back. I didn't cry. I just laid out the facts, one ugly piece at a time. He listened patiently, without a single interruption. When I was finished, the silence on the other end of the line wasn't empty. It was thoughtful. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice firm and reassuring, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are going to do nothing. When you go to that court, you will not say a word. You will let them talk. Let them say whatever they want to say. Just sit there and trust me. And trust in what you and Arthur built together. Trust. The words settled deep inside me, pushing out the last of the fear. My silence from that moment on became my strategy. It wasn't the silence of a confused old woman. It would be the silence of a queen on a chessboard, watching her opponents make all the wrong moves. I would go to that courtroom. I would listen to every lie and every insult. I would let them feel victorious, let them believe their cruel little plan was working perfectly. They had underestimated my mind, and they had certainly underestimated my memory. But most of all, they had forgotten who I really was. They thought they were judging me, but in reality, they were just digging their own grave, not knowing the shovel was already in my hands. The days leading up to the hearing were a living nightmare. David and Sarah started acting as if they already owned everything, as if my home was already theirs. One morning, I was out tending to my roses, my hands in the soil, when I saw a man in a suit walking around my garden with a clipboard. He was measuring the distance from the fence to the back porch. I walked over, my heart beating a little too fast. He smiled a slick, professional smile and said, "Good morning. Mr. Peterson sent me over for an appraisal." Mr. Peterson, not David. Mr. Peterson. It was a cold, formal title meant to put me in my place. I simply looked at him and said, "This is private property. You need to leave now." My voice didn't shake. The calmness in it seemed to unnerve him more than any shouting would have. He stammered an apology and left quickly. A few days later, Sarah came by herself. She breezed in with a fake, worried smile and went straight to my bedroom. I followed her. I found her with her hands on my mother's old wooden jewelry box. "I was just thinking, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "that I should keep these valuables in a safe place for you, so they don't get lost." She was trying to take them. The pearls Arthur gave me for our 10th anniversary. My mother's locket. I put my hand over hers on the box and said simply, "No." She snatched her hand back as if my skin had burned her, her face twisting with an anger she couldn't hide. She saw my calmness not as strength, but as stubbornness, another sign of my supposed condition. In court, the humiliation was public and complete. They didn't put me with the spectators. They sat me in a chair near the front, like a defendant on trial for a crime. And then David took the stand, my son. He looked so handsome in his suit, so confident. And he began to speak. He told the court about my memory lapses. He invented stories out of thin air. He spoke of a time I supposedly left the stove on all night, filling the house with gas. It never happened. He described how I supposedly got lost walking home from the grocery store just 2 blocks away, and how a kind neighbor had to bring me back. A complete lie. With every lie, I just looked at his face. I was searching, desperately, for a flicker of the boy I had raised, the one who used to run to me with a scraped knee, trusting me to make it better. But he wasn't there. All I saw was an ambitious stranger, his eyes cold and focused. Then it was Sarah's turn. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she described the terrible burden of worrying about me. She spoke of sleepless nights, of the constant fear for my safety. She painted a perfect picture for the judge, a frail, confused old woman who was a danger to herself, and a loving son and daughter-in-law who were only trying to help. And I remained silent, just as Mr. Davies told me to. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me. The prosecutor looked convinced, nodding along to Sarah's performance. The judge, he just looked at me with pity. That was almost the worst part. I wasn't an opponent to be respected. I was a problem to be managed, an object of sorrow. In that moment, I felt utterly and completely alone, a tiny island of truth in a vast ocean of their lies. The pain was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on my chest, but the memory of Arthur's words, his promise, was a steel rod in my spine, holding me upright. Their victory seemed so certain. David's lawyer was making his final statements, summarizing all the evidence of my decline. He gestured toward me, speaking of the need for immediate and decisive action. The room was still. All that was left was for the judge to speak. I could see him picking up his gavel. He looked at me one last time, his expression one of sad finality. He was about to bring that gavel down, and with it, seal my fate, erasing my name, my home, and my identity forever. The judge's hand was in the air, the wooden gavel held high, ready to fall. I could see the finality in his eyes, the pity. This was it, the end of my story, written by my own son. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rustle of my own dress. And then a chair scraped against the floor. "Your Honor," a calm voice cut through the silence. It was Mr. Davies. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, holding the attention of the entire room. "Before you render your decision, I ask the court's permission to present one final document. It will clarify the matter of the house's ownership, which is the primary asset in this dispute." David's lawyer let out a short, scoffing laugh. "Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. The deed is clear. The property was in the late Mr. Arthur Peterson's name. My client, his son, is the sole and rightful heir." He waved a dismissive hand towards me. Mr. Davies didn't even look at him. He simply walked toward the judge's bench, holding an old, faded manila envelope, the same one Arthur had given me all those years ago. He pulled out a document, its pages yellowed and soft with time, and handed it up to the judge. "Your Honor," Mr. Davies said, his voice steady and clear, echoing in the silent room. "This is the original bill of sale for the property at 214 Oak Street. As you can see, the house never belonged to the late Mr. Arthur Peterson. It was purchased by Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, with money from an inheritance left to her by her own parents. The purchase was made 2 years before she was married." A stillness fell over the courtroom. Not just quiet, but a deep, profound silence, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The words hung there, simple, plain, and devastating. I turned my head and looked at my son. The confident, smug expression on David's face dissolved like sugar in water. His mouth fell slightly open. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale and shocked. Beside him, Sarah's mask of concern shattered completely, replaced by a look of raw, ugly disbelief. Her eyes, which had been gleaming with greed, were now wide with the horror of her miscalculation. The entire foundation of their case, the whole elaborate story of protecting his father's assets, was gone. It had never existed. The house wasn't his inheritance to protect. It was mine. It had always been mine. The judge read the document carefully, his brow furrowed. He looked from the old paper to the newer deeds they had presented. Then he looked up, and his eyes met mine across the courtroom. And for the first time that day, what I saw wasn't pity. It was respect. A small, almost imperceptible nod. He cleared his throat and looked down at David and his lawyer. His voice was firm, stripped of all its earlier sympathy. This petition is predicated on the preservation of an expected inheritance. As this document proves, the primary asset in question is not and never was part of the deceased's estate. There is no inheritance to preserve. This court has no jurisdiction. He picked up his gavel, and this time, when it came down, the sound was sharp and final. Case dismissed for lack of subject matter. There was no victory cheer. There was no shouting. No, I told you so. There was no need. There was only the truth, laid bare in the quiet courtroom, as powerful and as undeniable as the rising sun. My silence had won. In that instant, my son didn't just lose a court case. He didn't just lose the house he was so desperate to sell. In that silent, echoing moment, as he stared at me with the eyes of a complete stranger, he lost the moral right to an inheritance that, in fact, had never even belonged to him. Leaving that courthouse was like taking my first breath after being underwater for a long, long time. The air in my lungs felt new, clean. Mr. Davies drove me home in his quiet, sturdy car. We didn't say much on the ride. There was nothing to say. He pulled into my driveway, walked me to my front door, and then we just stood on the porch for a moment. He put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You're a strong woman, Eleanor," he said, and that was all. There was no celebration, no triumphant toast. There was just a serene, quiet relief that settled over me like a warm blanket. I went inside and sat in my armchair, the one my hand had rested on when they gave me the summons. The house was exactly the same, but I was different. The silence that had once felt heavy with their betrayal now felt light, clean. It was my silence again. David and Sarah never contacted me again. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a word. In the first few weeks, I'd sometimes catch myself glancing at the phone when it rang, a little jolt in my chest. But it was never him. Their absence left a void. I won't deny that. He is, after all, my son. But it was a clean void, a space that was no longer filled with anxiety, with judgment, with that sickening feeling of being a burden. It was a space free of the toxicity they had brought with them. Slowly, my life started over. It began with the same simple things as before, but with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I went back to tending my rose bushes. The thorns didn't seem so sharp anymore, and the blooms looked more vibrant, their colors deeper than I remembered. My morning coffee on the porch became a ritual of peace, not of lonely waiting. The neighbors, who had watched the whole sad drama unfold from behind their curtains, started looking at me differently. Mrs. Gable from next door, who used to give me these sad, pitying smiles, stopped me by the fence one morning. "It's good to see you looking so well, Eleanor," she said, and her eyes weren't filled with pity anymore. They were filled with admiration. I started calling old friends, women I hadn't spoken to in years, thinking I was too much of a problem to bother them. We met for tea. We talked about our gardens, our grandchildren, the aches in our joints. We laughed. I discovered that true family isn't always the one that shares your blood. It's the one that respects you, the one that sees you for who you are. The house, which for a moment had become the symbol of my oppression, the prize in their cruel game, once again became my sanctuary. Every corner no longer reminded me of the fight, but of my own quiet resilience. I'd run my hand along the banister Sarah had criticized, and I'd smile. It was my banister. This was my home. I learned that dignity isn't something someone can give you or take away. It isn't in what you have, but in who you are. And I was Eleanor, a woman who, though bent by a profound pain, had refused to break. Today, the peace I feel comes not from owning the house, but from the certainty that I am the sole author of my own story. I look at my life today, and I don't pretend the scars aren't there. They are. I see them when I look in the mirror, not on my skin, but deeper in my eyes. I feel them sometimes on quiet evenings, a faint echo of that cold courtroom, of my son's voice. The pain of a child's betrayal is a unique kind of wound. It's a grief for someone who is still alive, and it's something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But that pain, as terrible as it was, it taught me something. It taught me that our worth isn't defined by how others see us, or even by how the people we love the most choose to treat us. It's defined by how we respond to that treatment. In the face of their greed and their lies, I could have screamed. I could have fought. I could have collapsed into a puddle of bitterness and hate. And in a way, that's what they wanted. It would have proven their point, that I was just a hysterical, confused old woman. Instead, I chose to respond with the only thing they couldn't take from me, my dignity. I chose the dignity of silence, and in that silence, I found a strength I never knew I had. It's a quiet strength. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's just there, like the deep roots of an old tree, holding me steady when the wind blows. I think about how easy it is for the world to dismiss you when you get older. Your steps get slower, your hands might shake a little, and suddenly people start talking to you as if you're not there. They talk about you, over you, but not to you. They see the gray hair and the wrinkles, and they forget about the life that was lived to earn them. They forget about the stories you hold, the wisdom you've gathered, the love you've given. You become a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be handled instead of a person to be cherished. My son and his wife, they looked at me and they didn't see a mother. They saw a liability. They saw a house, an asset. They tried to turn me into a ghost in my own life, to erase my story and write their own ending over it. They almost succeeded. And you? Have you ever been treated as if your story, your memories, and your voice no longer mattered by the very people you loved and protected the most? Have you ever felt like you were becoming invisible inside your own home, to your own family? I ask you that because it's the loneliest feeling in the world, isn't it? To feel yourself fading away while you're still standing right there. For a time, I truly believed that was my fate, that they were succeeding in erasing me, turning me into a whisper in my own home. But they couldn't erase what was written on my soul. They couldn't take away the memories that lived in these walls, or the strength my Arthur always knew I had. This morning, I was out in my garden just as the sun was starting to warm the earth. My hands, the ones that trembled so much in that cold courtroom, were steady as I pruned my rose bushes. There's something about having your hands in the soil that grounds you, that reminds you of what is real and true. I felt the rough bark under my fingers, snipped away the dead wood from the winter, making space for new life to grow. And I realized that's what I had to do in my own life. It was a painful pruning, cutting away a part of my own heart. But now there's room for new blooms. The peace I feel is not the thrill of victory, but the quiet satisfaction of a garden well tended. The silence in my house is different now. It used to be heavy, thick with disappointment and words I could never say. Now it's a comfortable silence. It's filled with the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the sound of my kettle whistling on the stove, the rustle of pages as I turn my book. I don't sit and wait for the phone to ring anymore. I have my friends. Mrs. Gable brings me fresh scones on Wednesdays. I play cards with old acquaintances I've reconnected with. We talk and we listen. And I've discovered that Eleanor Peterson, on her own, is actually very good company. The void left by my son, it's still there. A mother's love doesn't just switch off, but it no longer aches. It's a scar now, a reminder of a battle I survived, a reminder that my worth was never tied to his approval. I learned that our stories are the most precious things we own. They are the fabric of who we are. When someone tries to rewrite your story or steal it from you, they are trying to steal your very being. Sharing these stories, listening to one another, it's how we fight back against being made invisible. It's how we hold a light up for each other in the dark. It creates a connection, a community of hearts who understand. And that connection is so precious. You have to be mindful of it, protect it. I've learned that sometimes even the connections we choose can get broken without us even noticing. And if you want to keep receiving real stories like this, be aware. YouTube might be unsubscribing you without notice. It's a strange thing, but I'm told it happens. So please, just take a moment to check that you're still subscribed to the channel, and maybe turn on that little notification bell. That way, our thread won't be accidentally cut, and these stories won't get lost in the silence. Because knowing there is someone out there listening, it means everything. It's the greatest peace, knowing your truth has a place in this world, and that you never have to fight for your own dignity again. It was always yours to begin with.